Welcome to Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin. Today, my dear friends and subscribers, I would like to talk about the very controversial topic that just came up in the context of a telephone conversation from President Trump to President Putin. And the title of my presentation is Iran War Aims and Russia. Now, what is the connection between Iran war aims and Russia and the telephone conversation from President Trump to President Putin? Well, this is what we're going to talk today, and I'd like to discuss this in somewhat more detail. The reason for that is that there was some speculation by various sources and observers as to what actually was said, and was there anything that President Trump offered to President Putin during this conversation. Now, according to the readout, and the only readout that exists is a readout which is a summary, not a verbatim readout, summary provided by Mr. Ushakov, who is President Putin's national security advisor. And according to Ushakov, there's really not much. There's just general words about the frank and constructive conversation, and there was a reference that they talked about the speedy conclusion of Ukraine war. And then there was a discussion of Putin's efforts to seek peaceful solution in the Middle East and the Iran war, with Putin's contacts with the leaders of the Gulf states and the leaders with the Iranian leaders and so on. There was absolutely nothing in this conversation that could suggest that there was something interesting, something new, something fundamental. That doesn't mean that didn't happen. The only thing that we know is what Ushakov reported. Now, on the Western side, there were no readout at all. There were just a few words that Trump pronounced in Florida to the effect that he had a good conversation with Putin, and it was the Western media took it as a strange sort of thing to do on the wake of reports that Russia was providing military assistance and military intelligence to Iran in order to hit American targets. In that context, it appeared strange that Trump would call Putin and make any kind of arrangement with him, especially since it was also reported there was some relief to Russian sanctions and the Russian oil sales to India, and some talk about some relief for a month so that there is no bottlenecks in the world market supply of oil. That in itself, as far as the Russians are concerned, they don't really mention it, would be perceived as an affront, as an insult, because the Russians have always maintained that they are free to sell oil whoever they want to, wherever they want to, and Western sanctions and the United States unilateral sanctions are illegal because they have no standing of international law, as they were not approved by the Security Council of the United Nations. Anyway, leave that as it may be. The crux of the matter is that there was an interpretation which actually moved me to argue with this interpretation, and that is by Mr. John Helmer. He's an Australian journalist, and he published an interpretation, a discussion of this conversation, and he argues, Mr. Helmer does, that Trump offered Putin a deal. And that's the whole intrigue about it. What kind of a deal? The deal, according to Helmer, is that Trump ostensibly, he asked Putin not to provide any help to Iran. In other words, let Iran be defeated, let the United States continue with its assault on Iran, and in exchange, he ostensibly offered to Putin to not do anything for Ukraine and essentially allow a free hand for Putin to do whatever the Russians are doing in Ukraine. Now that is of course an intriguing proposition, and that moved me to discuss it because I find it quite unlikely, and I will discuss as to why. But at least that is a kind of theoretically a very interesting question. What if indeed there was a chance for the Russians to leave Iran to fight for itself, and in exchange to pursue a kind of agreement that allows Russia finally to defeat the Banderovite regime in Ukraine and proclaim victory? So let's discuss this in somewhat more detail. The first question is, does Iran need Russian help? And do they provide military intelligence? Nobody knows. The Russians themselves say neither yes nor no, simply that they do provide help to Iran. But even if they do, one has to be aware that the United States has been providing military intelligence to Ukraine for years. Not only intelligence, but also missiles and the guiding teams and software to target those missiles into Russian territory. So even if the Russians are doing it, that would be just no more than what the United States has been doing and is still doing in Ukraine. Now, the answer may also be that it's not only Russia. It could also be that Chinese are providing assistance in the targeting and in the satellite information and targeting information. Is quite possible. And obviously the North Koreans have announced that they would do anything they can, and everything they have is at the disposal of the Iranians. But for our purposes, let's just consider for the moment the first argument, and that is that that Putin might be interested in this proposition, and if so, why? And are there any indications that may be so? And so the argument goes like this: those who support this point of view, that Putin has, and Helm argues that Putin had always had a soft spot for Trump, that he never criticizes Trump. He has been cultivating relations with Trump. They do refer to it as a spirit of anchorage. And of course, Putin's support of Kiriyenko. He keeps going to America and keeps talking to Witkoff and Kushner, and they keep meeting each other and in Geneva and elsewhere, and therefore this process is still alive, the argument goes, and therefore it is quite possible that that they may be ready to accept some kind of an agreement with President Trump. Now, in terms of a Russian domestic opinion, those who are sympathizing with the so-called Western orientation, those who dream of getting things back to what they would call normal, the way they used to be before sanctions, they are usually the business elites. And they are disliked, to put it mildly, by the generals, by the army, by the more conservative and more nationalist circles in Russia. One of them is General Sivkov, whom I cite quite often, and he refers over and over in many of his programs to these people as the fifth column. Now, the fifth column, as you may know, is a reference to what was called the sympathizers of General Franco during the civil war in Spain. The fifth column are the spies, the enemies, the hidden enemies inside. That's what the fifth column means. In other words, from the point of view of nationalists and people like Sivkov, there are these capitalist elements that they don't like, who sympathize with the West, and they are enemies from within, and Kiriyenko and other Western-looking businessmen are such people. Now, that shows, of course, that there's a divided opinion in Russia, and most of the patriotic opinion would be against this kind of a deal. Moreover, and this is my second part of the argument, which is those who are totally against any deal with Trump, especially now. And that is where I would remind Mr. Helmer that the situation changed drastically in Russia over the last week as the war was going on. And that means that there's a drastic, radical anti-American feeling in Russia. People are saying that Trump cannot be trusted, that his demand of unconditional surrender of Iran is preposterous, that the murder of Ayatollah is treacherous, that you cannot trust the Americans or especially Trump, and that there is no way any kind of a deal with this regime, Zelensky regime, could be considered now, and Russia should demand unconditional surrender of Ukraine, just as Trump demands it of Iran. In other words, sharply negative, anti-Trumpist, anti-American, pro-Iranian reaction in Russian society, and especially in the army and in the patriotic circles. So that sort of means that it would be, that also implies that President Putin is in somewhat of a bind now, because he had put so much effort into the negotiations and into the negotiating settlement and with the spirit of anchorage, that in a way he is now between the two polarized opinions in Russia, and the question is what he would side finally in this dilemma. Now, what I would argue that I would agree with those who point out the opposite point, the opposite direction of President Putin, and that is that he had put in a lot of effort into building the BRICS and building the alliance with China and with India and with Iran. And he is the one who signed the treaty with Iran in 2025. And he is the one who has been saying all along that the multipolarity should replace the American domination and the American hegemony. And he did it sincerely. And I remember it in many, many speeches when Putin is saying that multipolarity is the future, that BRICS is the alternative, that BRICS is the alternative to American-dominated system. Moreover, people like Bezrukov, who is a very respected Russian intelligence officer, has been saying lately that Iranians do have enough missiles and they put them in tunnels and they did a great job, and we, the Russians, he said, should imitate them, and they can fight successfully for many, many months before they run out of missiles. Now, in other words, the big picture is that Putin has invested much, much more effort into cultivation of relations with China and with India and with Iran. And from that point of view, it is simply inconceivable that he would just give it all up in order to make a compromise with Trump and abandon Iran. Just doesn't make any sense. And that brings me finally to the war aims of Iran. War aims of Iran are very clear, and they announced those quite openly in recent days, and that is the elimination of American bases from the Middle East, But that's only one, a military objective. The second objective is to make sure Israel would never threaten Iran again. And the economic component of their war aims is to make sure that the Gulf states would no longer be subordinates of the United States, that they would take their petrodollars and reinvest them not in the United States but in the BRICS countries and reorient them to the East. And now, from that point of view, this becomes a much, much bigger picture and involving fundamental interests of the great powers, which is that the United States lived since 1945 on the petrodollars, who were used as a currency to buy oil, and then these oil revenues the Gulf states used in order to buy American military hardware and all kinds of high tech, and on top of it they would spend the rest on buying American securities. Now is the time when they began shifting their trade and their holdings to China and to the multipolar world. And if that process continued, Trump announced, and he's right about that, would be a mortal danger to United States domination. But, my dear friends, from that point of view, it is in Russia's national interest to promote exactly that, to promote de-dollarization, multipolarity, and shifting from the petrodollar to a new currency that is a national currency or yuan, or some new payment mechanism that is being developed by BRICS. In other words, to put it bluntly, war aims of Iran coincide completely with what Putin has been doing and saying for the last 10 years, and that is creating a multipolar world that would not rely on American domination. Now, there are two examples that show how difficult it is for countries to get rid of American domination, even if they want to. And these two examples are Iraq, and Spain. Iraq, for many, many times already, as a government, asked the United States to leave, to close its bases in Iraq and leave and stop using its oil. But it doesn't happen. The United States continues to ignore the government of Iraq and to dispose of its oil the way they see fit. In other words, it's as my expression, it's a hostage nation. The United States is treating Iraq as a country they control and they order it what to do. They did the same thing recently with Venezuela. It's a hostage nation. It will be doing what it is ordered by the boss, by the new colonial power, by the United States. Now with Spain, it's a little bit more complicated because it's not a matter of natural resources, but Spain announced that it does not want its base, its territory to be used in attacks of Iran. The United States ignored Spain and in a kind of a brazen way announced that they could use their base on the territory of Spain, whatever. And they're not going to ask permission from Spain. What is Spain going to do? Shoot American airplanes? In other words, they are a hostage nation. And that the United States says we're going to do whatever we want without asking you whether you like it or not. But that in itself is a declaration to the rest of the world that the United States is not a protector, but a hostage taker. That is a message to the Gulf states that the United States is not protecting them, but is using them and would not let them go even if they wanted to. And that puts Iran war aims on a totally different level, because it shows to these states that what Iran aims are is to free those countries from American tutelage so that they could pursue their national interest. And that means that there's no way that Putin could reverse this process or help Trump reverse this process, because he had been fighting for it for at least 10 years. So, my dear friends, I stop at this, and I invite you to read my book, From Vladimir Lenin to Vladimir Putin, and also look at my previous videos on the current affairs and issues of contemporary politics, and my history playlists on Russian history, Soviet history, European history, and others. And today I am finishing. Thank you very much, and I will see you soon with another edition of Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin. Goodbye.